So imagine for a second that you are the CEO of this soaring, highly celebrated tech manufacturing company.
Okay, a nice position to be in.
Right. Your flagship product is incredible. The market absolutely loves it. And for, well, a solid 3 years, your growth has just been explosive. You are the darling of your industry.
Making the cover of all the magazines, yeah.
Exactly. But then, almost overnight, the trend line just flips. Sales start to slump. Orders are dropping off.
Oh, wow. Panic mode.
Yeah, total panic. You look at the spreadsheet, you see the declining revenue, and you make what seems like the most logical, universally accepted business decision possible, right? You declare a sales emergency.
Because sales are down, so you need more sales.
Makes sense. So you aggressively expand your sales force, you pump millions into marketing, and you incentivize your team to just push harder than ever before.
Ah.
Now, here's the mystery. That exact decision, that perfectly logical textbook reaction to dropping sales, is the specific action that permanently destroys your company.
Which just sounds completely counterintuitive.
Right. Why does that happen?
Well, it violates every basic rule of linear business logic. But the truth is, when you're operating a complex organization, linear logic is often the fastest path to self-destruction.
Seriously?
Yeah, I mean, that CEO didn't fail because they lacked drive or business acumen. They failed because they were suffering from this fundamental structural blindness. They were reacting to a symptom instead of diagnosing the actual system.
Have you ever felt that way in your own career? Or, even just in your personal life? You feel like you're constantly playing this high-stakes game of whack-a-mole.
Oh, absolutely, all the time.
You pour all your energy into solving one urgent, screaming problem. You hit that mole right on the head, only to watch another crisis just immediately burst out of the ground somewhere else.
Yeah, and you're exhausted, you're running at full capacity, but somehow you aren't actually moving forward.
Right, you are just managing to decay.
And that feeling of exhaustion, that sense of running on a treadmill just to keep the lights on, is the absolute hallmark of an organization or even an individual that has become trapped in the snapshot.
Trapped in the snapshot. I like that phrasing.
Yeah, they are managing isolated events without ever seeing the invisible architecture that actually generates those events in the first place.
And breaking out of that trap is our mission for this deep dive. Today, we are unpacking a really profound conceptual framework that changes entirely how we process reality.
It really is a total paradigm shift.
We are going to explore how a single shift in perspective rewires the diagnosis phase of strategic planning. We'll break down why treating symptoms is, frankly, the most fatal trap a leadership team can fall into.
And we will trace how diagnosing invisible structures didn't just change corporate boardrooms, but literally revolutionized the landscape of South Asian informal markets and extreme poverty.
Yeah, we're going to look at everything from toy companies to trash collectors to understand the physics of complex systems.
But to do that, we have to start at the bedrock of how we think. We have to introduce a concept that is the concrete difference between organizations that adapt and thrive in a chaotic world and those that just collapse under the weight of their own unseen structures.
The word for that bedrock concept is metanoia. It has Greek origins, actually.
Right, meta and noia.
Exactly. Meta meaning above or beyond, implying a sort of transcendence, and noia from the root nos, meaning mind. So it literally translates to a transcendence of mind.
Which sounds very philosophical.
It does. But the system scientist Peter Senge uses this specific ancient word to describe the absolute beating heart of what he calls a learning organization.
And how does he define that exactly?
Well, he argues that metanoia is a fundamental shift from seeing ourselves as separate from the world to seeing ourselves as intimately connected to it. It's the shift from seeing problems as being caused by someone or something out there to realizing how our own actions structurally create the exact problems we're experiencing.
It's interesting because Sanjanana deliberately avoids using the word learning for this.
Really? Why is that?
Because in modern culture, the word learning has kind of been degraded. If you memorize a capital city or, you read a quarterly earnings report, you say you learned something.
Right, you acquired a fact.
Exactly. But taking in information is just data processing. It leaves your internal map of reality completely unchanged. Senge is talking about a structural rewiring of how you perceive cause and effect.
And the best way to visualize what that rewiring actually looks like is the slinky analogy from the environmental scientist Donella Meadows. I am so fascinated by this analogy.
Oh, it's a great one.
Because it takes something so mundane and uses it to expose a massive flaw in our perception.
It really does. So let's walk through it. Imagine you are holding a slinky toy, right?
Okay, I've got my imaginary slinky.
You have one end pinched between your thumb and index finger, and the rest of the metal coil is dangling down toward the floor, suspended in the air. Now, you open your fingers. What happens?
Well, the slinky drops, but because it's a spring, it doesn't just fall flat. It bounces, It oscillates up and down, contracting and expanding as it falls.
Exactly. Now, if you ask someone, hey, what caused that bouncing behavior? Almost everyone will give the exact same answer.
They'd say, well, you opening your hand caused it.
Right.
Which, seems completely accurate.
Yeah.
If you hadn't opened your hand, the slinky wouldn't have moved.
Yeah.
The hand opening is the cause, and the bouncing is the effect.
But Meadows points out the huge flaw in that logic. Imagine that instead of a slinky, you were holding a porcelain teacup.
Oh, boy.
Right. If you open your fingers in the exact same way, the teacup doesn't bounce and oscillate. It simply hits the floor and shatters.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
But the action of the hand was identical. The environment was identical. The gravity was identical.
So the hand opening isn't actually the cause of the bouncing.
Exactly. The hand is merely the trigger. The actual cause of the bouncing behavior is embedded entirely within the physical structure of the slinky itself. The helical coil, the tension of the metal, the specific material properties.
That's wild. So the latent behavior was already built into the spring. The outside event just, released it.
Yep. And that distinction completely reframes how we look at blame. When the slinky bounces, we blame the hand. But it's the structure of the spring causing the behavior. We are just fundamentally biased against seeing the spring. We are obsessively focused on the hand.
We are entirely event-focused.
We really are. And, we shouldn't judge ourselves too harshly for that because there is a profound evolutionary reason behind it.
Survival, right.
Exactly. Our brains were sculpted over hundreds of thousands of years to prioritize immediate sudden events because that is what kept us alive.
Right. If you are a hunter-gatherer and a saber-toothed tiger suddenly steps out from behind a boulder, your survival depends on a massive instantaneous adrenaline spike.
You react to the event. You don't sit down and draw a causal loop diagram to analyze the systemic ecological pressures, or the drought conditions, or the prey migration patterns that drove the tiger into your valley.
No, you run.
You run. We are biologically hardwired to scan the horizon for tigers.
So our default setting is to see the world as a series of isolated snapshots. Event A causes event B. The tiger appears, I run. The hand opens, the slinky falls. But the modern world isn't the savannah.
No, it's not.
The threats we face today, whether we're talking about a Fortune 500 company or a public school system, almost never look like sudden tigers.
And that is the core conflict of modern management. The primary threats to our survival today are slow, gradual structural processes.
Like what?
Well, think about a company whose physical manufacturing capital is slowly becoming obsolete over a decade. Or a corporate culture that is gradually eroding product quality in order to hit quarterly financial targets.
Or, on a societal level, environmental decay and declining public education.
Yes. These are not sudden events. They are creeping structural realities. But because our brains are desperately looking for the tiger, we try to solve these slow-moving structural problems as if they were sudden, isolated events.
And the media ecosystem we live in doesn't just reflect that bias, it actively weaponizes it. Think about the news you consume. It is entirely designed to feed our appetite for snapshots.
No, completely.
You check your phone, and the headline is, the stock market dropped 400 points today because the Federal Reserve Chairman made a comment about interest rates. It creates a perfectly neat, linear narrative. Event A caused event B.
It is entirely event-to-event analysis. And while it might be technically true in a very narrow, localized sense, yes, the algorithmic trading bots reacted to the chairman's speech. It is a massive distraction.
A distraction from what?
From the longer-term macroeconomic feedback loops that actually govern the market over a 10-year horizon. It blinds you to them.
Oh.
If you only manage your life or your business at the event level, the absolute best you can ever hope to achieve is to predict the next event slightly before your competitor does, so you can react a fraction of a second faster.
So you are permanently trapped in a reactive posture. You can never get ahead of the curve to actively design or generate a new reality.
Right.
It seems like checking a stock ticker every 5 minutes to try and understand the fundamental health of the global economy. You are obsessing over the noise and missing the signal entirely.
That's a great way to put it.
But this raises a major psychological barrier for me. If we are evolutionarily programmed to look for the tiger, and our entire society rewards snapshot thinking. Isn't Senja's concept of metanoia essentially asking us to fight our own biology?
It absolutely is asking us to fight our default programming. It feels highly unnatural at first.
Because we love straight lines.
We are deeply comfortable with linear thinking. Cause leads to effect, problem leads to solution.
Yeah.
But complex human systems, economies, supply chains, families, they do not operate in straight lines. They operate in circles. They operate in complex, reinforcing, and balancing feedback loops. So achieving metanoia requires learning a completely new language of circles.
So how do you practically train a brain to see circles instead of lines?
By forcing yourself to pause and ask different questions. Instead of asking who did this or what just happened, you train yourself to ask, what is the pattern of behavior here over the last 3 years?
Looking at the trend, not the dot.
Exactly. And then you ask, what is the underlying structure that is driving that pattern? It requires immense cognitive effort at first. You literally have to manually translate your thoughts.
That sounds exhausting.
It is. But over time, as you force yourself to map out these structures, a shift occurs in your subconscious. One manager quoted in the research described the shift as being looped for life.
Looped for life. I love that.
Yeah, once your brain learns to recognize the invisible structures, you just can't unsee them. You automatically start surfacing solutions that were literally invisible to you when you were only looking at the snapshots.
Okay, so let's take that newly wired brain and apply it to the real world. If we achieve metanoia, how does that actually change the mechanics of how we plan and execute? How does it change the bedrock of business strategy?
It completely dismantles and rebuilds the very first phase of strategy, which is the diagnosis phase.
Let's bring in Richard Rumelt's framework here.
Right.
Because Rumel argues that a lot of what corporations call strategy is really just a wish list of financial goals.
Oh, absolutely. Increase revenue by 20% isn't a strategy.
Exactly. He says that a true good strategy must have a core kernel made up of 3 distinct elements. First, you need a diagnosis that defines the specific nature of the challenge. Second, you need a guiding policy for how you intend to deal with that challenge. And third, you need coherent action, which are the coordinated steps you take to execute the policy.
Right.
But that first step, the diagnosis, seems to be where everything falls apart.
Because people are so biased toward action. When a crisis hits, the board of directors wants to know, what are we going to do? They want the coherent action immediately.
They want the quick fix.
Yeah. But if you haven't diagnosed the difficulty accurately, your actions are going to be completely misdirected. A good diagnosis is meant to simplify the overwhelming, chaotic complexity of reality.
It takes thousands of isolated data points, filters out the noise, and links the vital facts into a recognizable pattern.
It is the act of deciding what matters and what should be ignored.
And the distinction we need to draw here is between a standard diagnosis and a systemic diagnosis. The sources use Starbucks as a fascinating hypothetical case study to illustrate this.
I love this example.
Yeah, imagine Starbucks is going through a slump. Foot traffic is down, same-store sales are flattening, and the stock price is taking a hit. If you assemble 3 top executives in a boardroom and ask them for a diagnosis, you will get 3 entirely different realities based on their individual lenses.
Exactly. The VP of marketing might look at the data and say, well, we have an expectations problem. Customers expect too much personalization, and it's slowing down the line. We need to reset expectations.
Okay, that's one view.
But then the head of product innovation might look at the exact same data and say, no, the market is saturated. We have a growth problem. We need to invent a completely new category of beverage to attract a different demographic.
A frappuccino, basically.
Right. And then the chief operations officer might chime in and say, you are both wrong. We have an eroding competitive advantage. Boutique coffee shops are undercutting our premium feel, and we need to cut operational costs to compete on price.
And whichever diagnosis wins the argument in that boardroom completely dictates the future of the company.
It dictates everything.
If marketing wins, you get a massive PR campaign. If product wins, you get a new drink. If operations wins, you get mass layoffs and automated espresso machines.
Yeah.
But none of those diagnoses are actually objective facts, are they?
No, not at all. They are judgments. They are highly subjective interpretations about the meaning of the facts. But notice that all 3 of those standard diagnoses are still relatively linear. Well, they define a problem and suggest a direct countermeasure. A systemic diagnosis, born out of metanoia, goes much deeper into the architecture. It wouldn't just look at declining sales. It would ask, what are the structural feedback loops causing the decline?
Right.
A systemic thinker might look at Starbucks and realize, hey, Our massive, aggressive expansion campaign increased our total revenue, but the speed of that expansion required us to hire thousands of undertrained baristas.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Yeah, which structurally degraded the intimacy of the customer experience, which eroded brand loyalty, which is now manifesting as flattening sales.
Wow. So the expansion itself is what broke the customer experience. That is a wildly different insight.
It completely changes the required action.
And what stands out to me about a systemic diagnosis is that it fundamentally eliminates the blame game. In standard snapshot management, when something goes wrong, the immediate reflex is to find the villain. Sales are down because the regional managers are lazy.
Always looking for the bad apple.
But systems thinking insists that there is no outside enemy. You and the cause of your problems are part of a single, continuous system.
The story of the steel cord manufacturer in the sources perfectly captures the danger of the blame game. Two organizational researchers went in to study this manufacturing plant, and the company was obsessively focused on one core metric, which was machine uptime.
Because every minute a machine was broken, they were losing money.
Exactly. So management implemented a system that heavily pressured and incentivized their maintenance engineers to respond to machine breakdowns with absolute maximum speed.
Which, again, feels like completely logical management. The machine breaks, you want it fixed fast so production can resume. You incentivize speed.
Sure, on paper. But the factory floor was a disaster. The machines were constantly failing. Uptime was terrible.
So what did management do?
Management's initial snapshot diagnosis was to blame the engineers. They assumed the workers were either incompetent, poorly trained, or just lacking motivation.
But that wasn't true.
No. When the researchers ignored the personnel files and started analyzing the actual maintenance logs, machine by machine, they discovered a hidden reinforcing loop.
What were the engineers actually doing?
Because the engineers were under immense systemic pressure to hit response time metrics, they didn't have the time to actually dismantle a machine, diagnose the root mechanical failure, and order the proper replacement parts.
They didn't have the time to fix it right.
Exactly. Instead, they would sprint to a broken machine, slap a temporary patch on it, duct tape, and baling wire essentially get it running, and sprint to the next crisis.
Oh my gosh.
The researchers found that, on average, every single breakdown was hastily patched 3 separate times before an engineer finally had the bandwidth to fix it properly.
Wow. So the management was blaming the engineers for the failures, but the management's own incentive structure, an intense pressure for speed, was physically preventing the machines from being fixed.
Yep. The engineers weren't lazy. They were acting perfectly, rationally, within the absurd constraints of the system they were placed in.
The system structure caused its own behavior. If you just fire those engineers and hire a new crew, the exact same cycle will repeat itself because the structure of the incentives hasn't changed.
As Deming famously said, a bad system will beat a good person every time.
It's incredible how blind we can be to our own structures. But that brings up a massive logistical challenge. You have a boardroom full of highly paid, highly experienced executives. How do you actually get them to agree on a systemic diagnosis? Because every individual in that room is walking in with their own incredibly stubborn view of reality.
This is what organizational theorists call bounded rationality. It is the humbling admission that complex systems are simply too vast, too intricate for any one human brain to comprehend in their entirety.
So we all have blind spots.
Massive ones. An executive sitting in the marketing department sees one small sliver of the elephant. The VP of manufacturing sees a completely different sliver. They each make decisions that appear perfectly logical, completely rational from their local perspective.
But zooming out.
But because their rationality is bounded by their limited view, those local decisions often inflict massive collateral damage on the rest of the system.
Give me an example of how that local rationality causes systemic damage.
Okay, imagine the marketing department is under pressure to hit quarterly targets. So they launch a massive, highly successful discount promotion, demand skyrockets, the marketing team celebrates, they did their job perfectly.
High fives all around.
Right, but over in manufacturing, they don't have the raw materials or the labor to meet that sudden artificial spike in demand. So product quality drops as they rush production, delivery times extend from 3 days to 3 weeks, and the customer service department is overwhelmed with furious buyers.
Wow.
The marketing team's rational success structurally destroyed the brand's reputation.
So how do you break through that bounded rationality? How do you get the marketing VP and the manufacturing VP to see the same elephant?
Sench argues that the only way to achieve this is through the discipline of mental models and team learning. Mental models are the deeply ingrained assumptions, generalizations, and even pictures or images that influence how we understand the world and how we take action.
They are our internal operating systems.
Exactly. If an executive team wants to reach a systemic diagnosis, they cannot just debate the data. They have to physically unearth their hidden mental models.
Yeah.
They have to get in a room, stand in front of a whiteboard, and explicitly draw out the feedback relationships they believe exist.
They have to say out loud, I believe that if we push this lever, this other thing breaks.
Yes. Until they expose their individual assumptions to the group, they're just blindfolded people shouting at each other.
They have to accept that their personal view of reality is just a model, not the absolute truth. Now, if establishing a shared systemic diagnosis is the foundational bedrock of a good strategy, what happens when a CEO ignores all of this? What happens when a leader remains completely trapped in the snapshot of crisis management?
This brings us to what systems thinkers identify as the single most fatal, most common mistake a leader can make. It is a specific behavioral pattern known as a systems archetype, and this one is called shifting the burden.
Let's spend some time here because this is the absolute core of the CEO perspective we promised to cover. Break down the mechanics of the shifting the burden trap.
Okay, so when a problem arises in an organization, a leader generally has two avenues of response. They can apply a fundamental solution, which requires diagnosing the underlying structure and doing the hard work to alter it. Or they can apply a symptomatic solution, which is a quick fix designed purely to eliminate the immediate pain.
And the catch is,
The psychological trap is that fundamental solutions always involve a time delay. You don't see the results for months or years. Symptomatic solutions, however, provide immediate relief.
so the leader, under pressure from shareholders or the board, naturally reaches for the painkiller.
Exactly. And because the painkiller works temporarily, the leader's mental model is reinforced. They think, I'm a great manager, I solved the problem.
But beneath the surface,
Beneath the surface, the fundamental structural decay is continuing to worsen. Even more dangerously, the symptomatic fix often produces unintended side effects that actively undermine the organization's ability to ever implement the fundamental solution.
so the burden of managing the problem has been entirely shifted away from structural reform and onto a temporary crutch.
Exactly.
To make this brutally concrete, we have to walk through the case study of WonderTech from the sources. This story is chilling because it is playing out in thousands of companies right now. Set the stage for us. What was WonderTech?
So WonderTech was this really brilliant high-tech manufacturing startup. They had developed a revolutionary product. The market fit was perfect. And for their first few years, they experienced astronomical hockey stick growth. They were expanding constantly.
Sound familiar to our intro.
Exactly. But then, as they matured, they hit a wall. Sales began to slump. The revenue line on the chart started pointing downward.
So the CEO looks at that snapshot, dropping sales, and makes a perfectly linear standard diagnosis. We have a sales problem. Our salespeople aren't closing.
Right. And what is the standard symptomatic solution for a sales problem? You push the sales force. You hire more account executives. You increase commission rates. You run aggressive advertising campaigns. And you demand hustle.
And the tragic part is the symptomatic fix actually worked, initially.
It did. The expanded sales team hustled. They brought in new accounts, and the sales numbers bumped back up. The CEO looked at the dashboard, saw the spike, and thought the crisis was averted.
But the reality was different.
Very. If you zoomed out and looked at their sales over a 3-year timeline, it looked like a roller coaster descending a mountain. They would hit a flump, aggressively push sales, experience a brief spike, and then the subsequent drop would be even deeper than the first. The cycle kept repeating, spiraling downward.
Because the CEO completely missed the actual architecture of the crisis. What was the invisible structure that was actually killing WonderTech?
The hidden reality was a capacity bottleneck. When WonderTech experienced its initial rapid growth, the manufacturing division simply could not keep up with the volume of orders. They physically couldn't build the machines fast enough.
So the factory floor is just jammed.
A massive backlog. And that backlog meant that delivery times ballooned. Customers who were promised delivery in 2 weeks were suddenly waiting 6 or 8 weeks. Word started to spread through the industry that WonderTech couldn't deliver on its promises.
Oh, that's a death knell for a startup.
Customers got furious, canceled their orders, and defected to competitors. That was the structural reason sales were slumping. It had absolutely nothing to do with the effort of the sales team. It was a crisis of reputation driven by a crisis of capacity.
This is the metanoia moment right here. So
Yeah.
once you see that structure, you realize that the CEO's decision to hire more sales reps was actually the exact mechanism destroying the company. By incentivizing the sales team to aggressively push more orders into a factory that was already paralyzed by a backlog, the CEO blew up the delivery times even further. They went from a 6-week delay to a 10-week delay. They were pouring gasoline on a fire while thinking it was water.
Precisely. They shifted the burden to the sales team instead of addressing the fundamental solution, which was to build more manufacturing capacity.
But why did the CEO make that mistake?
Because building a new factory, sourcing the equipment, and training new line workers takes 2 years. The delay is massive. Hiring a new sales rep takes 2 weeks. The CEO was blinded by the delay.
And by the time they realized what was happening,
By the time they finally realized they needed a new factory, the brand reputation was so irreparably damaged that the demand had permanently evaporated. WonderTech collapsed and went bankrupt, entirely because they managed the symptom and ignored the structure.
what I find terrifying about that is that the CEO wasn't stupid. How does someone smart become so incredibly blind to their own company? Is it ego? Arrogance.
Ego plays a part, sure, but it's deeper than that. The WonderTech failure highlights a fundamental law of complex systems that we referenced earlier, which is that cause and effect are not close in time and space.
We really need to underline that. Cause and effect are not close in time and space.
We desperately want them to be. In physical reality, they usually are. If I push a coffee mug off the edge of a table, it immediately smashes on the floor. The cause and the effect happen in the same room at the same second.
Right.
But in a highly complex human system, the cause of your current crisis might be a seemingly minor policy decision that was made 3 years ago by a completely different executive in a department 3 time zones away.
So the timeline tricks you.
Because the delay between the capacity shortage and the sales drop was so long, the WonderTech CEO couldn't connect the dots. The geographical and temporal distance between cause and effect tricks leaders into reaching for the painkiller that provides a localized, immediate result.
This leads to a phenomenon the sources describe as the visionary crisis manager. And I think anyone who has worked in a large corporation knows this person.
Oh, absolutely.
They are the executive who sweeps in like a superhero every time there's an emergency. They work 80-hour weeks, they put out the fire, everyone claps, and they get promoted. But they only ever manage at the event level.
And while they might be celebrated in the short term, over a 5-year horizon, that style of leadership systematically destroys the culture of an organization.
Why is that?
When an entire company is just bouncing violently from one reactive crisis to the next, it breeds a deep, pervasive cynicism among the employees. The staff begins to feel completely powerless. They realize they have no control over their own destiny. They are just being jerked around by unseen forces.
Morale just tanks.
And here is the tragedy. Any real generative vision requires a foundation of belief. Employees have to believe they can actually shape the future. The visionary crisis manager unintentionally poisons the very soil that a genuine vision needs to grow in.
If the complexity is so vast and cause and effect are so disconnected, how can any leadership team possibly manage it? We are fighting human nature, and on top of that, we are fighting the basic laws of physics. The sources talk about entropy, the natural tendency of any enclosed system to descend into disorder and chaos. Left to its own devices, a company will naturally become fragmented, siloed, and inefficient.
Right. Because entropy is constantly pulling the system apart, leaders cannot rely on their own intuition or their localized view from the corner office. They have to actively, deliberately design what systems thinkers call information flows.
Information flows.
Donella Meadows identifies the redesign of information flows as one of the most powerful leverage points for fundamentally changing how a system behaves.
How does designing an information flow prevent a WonderTech-style collapse?
You have to build the feedback loop directly into the operational dashboard. If WonderTech had structurally designed an information flow that explicitly required the executive team to review average delivery times and factory utilization rates in the exact same meeting where they reviewed sales targets, the CEO would have been forced to see the connection.
The data would be side by side.
The structure of the meeting would have broken their bounded rationality. You have to route the information from the hidden parts of the system directly to the people making the decisions, even if that information is uncomfortable.
Okay, but here's where the psychology gets really insidious. Let's say you do everything right. You have the dashboards, you have the information flows. You intellectually know that you shouldn't just treat symptoms. And yet, when the pressure hits, something deep inside our brain actively sabotages us. We physically lose the ability to see the system.
Yes, we do.
What is the psychological blind spot that violently yanks us back into this snapshot?
You are talking about the psychology of scarcity. And we need to be very precise here. Scarcity in this context is not an accounting term. It isn't just a physical lack of money in the bank or a lack of hours in the day.
What is it then?
Scarcity is an overwhelming psychological condition that literally physically captures the mind.
I think we all know this feeling viscerally. Think about a time when you were facing a massive, career-defining deadline, or a moment in your life when you were genuinely terrified about making rent. Your cognitive bandwidth completely collapses. You literally cannot process information that isn't directly related to surviving the immediate threat.
Behavioral economists refer to this psychological capture as the tunneling effect. When an individual or an entire organization is subjected to immense pressure, whether it's a scarcity of cash, a scarcity of time, or a collapsing market share, they enter the tunnel.
The tunnel.
They go into pure firefighting mode. And when you are inside that tunnel, your peripheral vision goes black. All you can perceive is the immediate burning crisis placed directly in front of you.
So scarcity is essentially a structural enforcement mechanism for event-level thinking. The tunnel forces you to look at the tiger and nothing else.
Yes. Now, we have to acknowledge that tunneling does provide a short-term biological advantage, which researchers call the focus dividend.
The focus dividend.
Because your mind is captured, you gain the ability to hyper-focus on the immediate problem. You can pull an all-nighter, ignore your family, ignore your health, and hammer out the proposal by 8:00 a.m.
The focus dividend is the superpower of the all-nighter. But what is the hidden cost?
The cost is that the tunnel completely annihilates your slack.
Let's unpack the concept of slack, because in traditional corporate environments, slack is a dirty word. If an employee has slack in their day, management sees it as inefficiency. It's viewed as wasted time that needs to be optimized out of the system.
That is the tragedy of hyperefficiency. From a systems thinking perspective, slack is not waste. Slack is the essential breathing room required for survival. It is the unallocated time, the financial reserves, the mental bandwidth that allows an organization to pause, step back, and actually observe the system they are operating within.
If you don't have it.
If an organization runs at 100% utilization with zero slack, it loses all capacity to experiment. It cannot reflect. It cannot learn. It is physically trapped at the event level, just trying to survive the sheer volume of daily tasks.
I love the analogy of trying to navigate out of a massive, complex maze while someone is standing on a balcony actively throwing water balloons at your head.
It's a great image.
If you have no slack, you aren't mapping the architecture of the maze. You aren't looking for patterns in the corridors. You are just frantically looking for the nearest wall to duck behind to avoid getting hit. You are tunneling. You are surviving, but you will never find the exit.
The water balloon analogy is perfect. When you are dodging balloons, you cannot achieve metanoia. So, the existential question for an organization becomes, how do you break the tunnel?
How do you forcefully inject slack into a system that is obsessed with efficiency?
One of the most effective methodologies for breaking the tunnel is human-centered design, which structurally demands that you abandon your statistical spreadsheets and go seek out extreme outliers and local qualitative knowledge.
The sources offer a brilliant, somewhat unexpected example of this. It involves the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the CDC, and a woman named Jennifer Portnick.
It is a remarkable story about how local knowledge can shatter a systemic blind spot. The CDC was trying to tackle the epidemic of youth obesity. Now, obesity is a classic, massively complex systemic issue driven by food supply chains, urban planning, poverty, and psychology. But the initial standard approach was highly statistical and top-down. The prevailing mental model, the assumption driving the policy, was that weight is inversely proportional to happiness. They assumed that all heavy people inherently want to be thin, and that a large physical size inherently implies a lack of discipline or fitness.
That is the spreadsheet view.
Yeah.
It's the view from inside the tunnel of traditional medical modeling.
Exactly. But the design team realized they needed to step out of the tunnel. They went looking for local knowledge, and they discovered Jennifer Portnick.
How was she?
Portnick was a size 18, and her absolute passion in life was fitness. She desperately wanted to be a professional jazzercise dance instructor, but the Jazzercise Corporation had a strict systemic policy. Instructors had to project a fit appearance, which they explicitly defined as being thin.
And Portnick refused to accept that premise.
Yeah.
She didn't just complain, she took legal action. She fought jazzercise, arguing that the concepts of fit and large are not mutually exclusive. She was incredibly athletic, had incredible stamina, and she essentially proved that their corporate mental model was fundamentally discriminatory and factually incorrect. She forced them to change their policy.
For the design thinkers working on the CDC obesity project, encountering Jennifer Portnick was a profound metanoia moment. She was an outlier who flourished on the extreme margins of the statistical bell curve.
She didn't fit the spreadsheet.
By observing her actual lived reality, the designers realized that their initial framing of the obesity problem was structurally flawed. They saw that health, fitness, and body image are part of a vastly more complex psychological and social system than a simple BMI spreadsheet could ever capture. Portnick broke their tunnel. She forced them to redesign their entire approach to incorporate the systemic nature of well-being.
So observing outliers breaks the tunnel. But how can a rigid corporate organization structurally mandate that kind of boundary-pushing exploration? How do you engineer slack into a culture that hates it?
You have to physically, geographically, and socially engineer protected spaces for it. The sources detail a fascinating experiment conducted by Ivy Ross when she was an executive at Mattel, the toy company.
Though this one is wild.
Mattel was trapped in a tunnel of efficiency. The pressure to pump out new toys and hit quarterly margins was crushing their ability to actually invent anything truly novel. The culture was stifling collaboration.
So what did Ivy Ross do?
She realized she couldn't fix the culture while leaving people at their normal desks. So she designed a 12-week immersive experiment that she named Platypus.
Platypus. Because it's an uncommon, strange mix of species.
Exactly. She pulled participants from completely isolated, siloed disciplines across massive company designers, marketers, engineers, supply chain experts, and physically relocated them to an entirely different alternative workspace.
And what did they do there?
She didn't just tell them to brainstorm toys. She put them through a bizarre creativity boot camp. They spent weeks learning improvised acting, studying advanced child psychology, and participating in deep group therapy-style sessions to unearth their mental models.
Wait, how does improvised acting help an engineer design a better plastic toy?
Improvised acting forces your brain to operate outside of linear logic. It forces you to react generatively, to accept a reality presented by someone else and build upon it, the classic yes and principle.
Oh, I see.
By mixing that with child psychology, she was breaking down their rigid corporate mental models and forcing them to see the world from the chaotic, systemic perspective of a child playing. She gave them total, mandated slack.
And what was the outcome?
It worked brilliantly. The Platypus Group produced a burst of highly innovative, commercially viable product concepts that never would have survived the grueling, critical gauntlet of the normal, tunneled corporate environment.
But the sources also highlight a very dark warning at the end of the platypus story. It wasn't a fairy tale ending.
No, it wasn't. When the 12 weeks were over and those platypus graduates were reintegrated into their normal everyday departments, the overarching corporate system fought back.
The immune system of the legacy organization.
Yes. The broader culture of efficiency, the rigid metrics, the daily pressure of the tunnel, it all crushed the newly learned behaviors. The immune system attacked the innovation.
Which proved that you can't just have a temporary innovation room and expect a lasting metanoia. If you don't permanently change the underlying structure, the way people are compensated, the way information flows, the daily cadence of slack, the system will aggressively revert to its historical baseline.
Systemic structure always wins in the long run.
Okay, we have spent a lot of time exploring how this plays out in corporate settings. We've looked at Starbucks, the Wonder Tech collapse, the steel factory, and Mattel. But to truly grasp the monumental stakes of metanoia, we need to leave the corporate boardroom. We need to look at how diagnosing invisible structures plays out in one of the most complex, unforgiving, and high-stakes environments on the planet. Extreme systemic poverty.
This is where systems thinking ceases to be an academic exercise or a margin-boosting business tool and becomes a literal matter of life, death, and human dignity. Because poverty is not just a lack of money. Poverty is not an event. Poverty is a deeply entrenched reinforcing system. It is a scarcity trap.
Let's apply our two diagnostic lenses, the snapshot diagnosis versus the systemic diagnosis, to the challenge of South Asian informal markets and the evolution of microfinance.
Historically, the standard top-down diagnosis of poverty by Western institutions and development economists was entirely linear. Poor people in rural villages do not have money. Without capital, they cannot start businesses to generate income. Therefore, the solution is to get formal banks to lend them money.
Problem, no money. Solution, bank loans. It makes perfect linear sense. But the reality on the ground was that formal commercial banks completely refused to touch these populations.
Right. And a standard diagnosis might conclude that the banks were just greedy or prejudiced or malicious. But a systemic diagnosis requires us to look at the structural mechanics of a bank loan. The barrier wasn't just malice, it was the crippling cost of information gathering.
Explain the information cost.
Imagine you are a loan officer at a formal commercial bank in a major city. A rural farmer who has no credit history, no collateral, no formal identification, and no written business plan walks in and asks for a tiny loan to buy seeds.
Okay.
To underwrite that loan safely, the bank has to send an agent to the village to verify the farmer's identity, assess their land, judge their character, and then continually monitor them to ensure they are using the money productively.
Which takes time and money.
A lot of it. The administrative transaction costs of gathering that information vastly exceed the tiny amount of interest the bank would ever earn on such a small loan. Structurally, the formal banking model physically cannot operate in that environment without losing money.
The formal system fails because of the structural barrier of information asymmetry. But human systems are incredibly resilient. When the formal system fails, the informal market always built a workaround. What was the systemic workaround in South Asia?
The poor turned to local, informal moneylenders. In the sources, they specifically highlight the history in Calcutta during the 1960s and 70s, where many of these moneylenders were the Kabuliwalas migrants from Kabul.
Now, if you view these moneylenders through a Western snapshot lens, they appear purely as exploitative villains charging usurious loan shark interest rates.
And they certainly caused immense suffering. But if you put on your systems thinking hat and look at it anthropologically, you realize that the informal market brilliantly solved the exact structural problem that defeated the formal banks.
How did the moneylenders solve the information cost problem?
Through the mechanisms of selective trust and localized social enforcement, the local moneylender doesn't need to hire an underwriter to run a credit check on the borrower. They live in the same village, they know the borrower's parents, they know if the borrower is an alcoholic or a hard worker, they know the borrower's exact reputation in the community.
So the cost of gathering information drops to absolute zero.
Exactly.
But knowing someone doesn't guarantee they will pay you back. How do they enforce the contract in a place with no formal courts or police to seize collateral?
They enforce it through the credible threat of violence or through total social and economic excommunication. The borrower understands that defaulting isn't just a mark on a credit score. It means physical harm or being cut off from the only financial lifeline their family has.
The consequences are immediate and catastrophic.
So the moneylender uses deep local knowledge to eliminate underwriting costs and severe localized pressure to eliminate default risk. It is a brutal, often violent system, but from a purely structural standpoint, it functions perfectly where commercial banks fail.
That is the horrifying reality of the scarcity trap. The informal system works, but it traps the borrower in perpetual debt. So, what was the microfinance metanoia? How did pioneers like Muhammad Yunus, who founded the Grameen Bank and won the Nobel Prize, or Padmakar Reddy, the founder of Spandana, fundamentally change this paradigm?
The true genius of the microfinance revolution was not simply raising charity money and offering cheap loans. That would have been a symptomatic fix that eventually ran out of funding.
So what was it?
The genius was a complete systemic redesign. Yunus and Reddy realized that they couldn't operate with the heavy administrative costs of a Western bank, but they also obviously couldn't operate using the violence and extortion of the Kabuliwalas.
They needed a third way.
They had to invent a third structure. They had to figure out how to leverage the pre-existing social architecture of the village, the selective trust, but completely strip away the violence.
And the mechanism they invented to do that was group liability.
Exactly. They changed the structure of the loan. Instead of lending to an isolated individual, they required borrowers, almost exclusively women, to form small groups, usually of 5. The institution would lend to the group as a whole.
Okay, and what's the structural brilliance of that?
If one single woman in the group defaulted or missed a payment, the entire group was permanently cut off from any future loans.
Wow. So they took the moneylender's threat of physical violence and they replaced it with the intense, localized social pressure of peer accountability.
Precisely. They co-opted the village's internal information network. The microfinance institution didn't need to assess who was a credit risk. The women themselves did the underwriting because they would never allow an unreliable person into their group.
Because their own neck is on the line.
Exactly. And the institution didn't need to send debt collectors. The women monitored each other, ensuring the money was used for business because their own financial futures depended on their peers' success.
By utilizing the existing social fabric, the microfinance organizations structurally reduced their own monitoring and enforcement costs to almost zero.
Which allowed them to offer life-changing capital at sustainable interest rates. It was a masterpiece of systemic design.
To understand the human impact of that systemic design, we have to look at the incredible story from the sources about a specific client of the microfinance institution, Spandana, located in Guntur, Andhra Pradesh. The subject of this case study was a woman working as a trash collector, which the researchers note is essentially the absolute bottom rung of the Indian socioeconomic hierarchy.
She was living in the deepest, darkest depths of the scarcity tunnel. Her entire existence was consumed by the daily panic of survival.
She received her first tiny microloan. And what is fascinating is that she didn't use that loan to dramatically launch a new enterprise. She didn't buy a factory or invent a product. She simply used that initial injection of capital to pay off the crippling high-interest debt she owed to a local moneylender.
Which is the most systemic intervention possible.
Exactly. Because what that single act did was give her breathing room. It gave her the one thing she lacked more than anything else: slack.
And pay attention to what she did the moment her mind was no longer entirely captured by the terror of the daily interest payment.
This is the turning point. With the moneylender off her back, the water balloon stopped hitting her. She finally had the mental bandwidth to step out of the tunnel and look at the broader supply chain she was operating within.
She was able to look around.
She looked at the people who were buying her raw trash, and she realized they were separating it: metal over here, plastic over there, organic waste here, and they were selling those sorted materials to larger recyclers for a massive profit margin.
Right.
Because she wasn't just frantically fighting fires anymore, she had the slack to start sorting the trash herself, capturing that extra margin.
She achieved her own personal metanoia. She saw the structure of the market.
She really did. And the progression is astounding. With her next loan, she bought a pushcart, greatly expanding her capacity. Then she got her husband, who previously spent his days drinking, to join her in the expanded business. Fast forward, and she isn't even collecting trash on the street anymore. She's managing a depot, employing other collectors, and orchestrating a localized recycling network.
It is a profound illustration that the intervention of the microloan was not primarily about the raw financial value of the cash. The cash was merely a tool to alter the structural conditions of her life.
It bought her the psychological slack necessary to see the larger system, to break out of the event-level panic, and to strategically reposition herself within the economic architecture.
Beautifully put.
But let me push back on this concept of tiny loans, because I think a lot of people struggle with the math here. The sources mention another specific loan program in India, operated by an organization called KGFS. They found massive demand for loans that averaged under $10, less than 10 US dollars.
Yep, very small.
Now wait, hold on. I can barely buy lunch in a major city with $10. If I am destitute, $10 isn't going to buy me a pushcart. It's not going to buy me a storefront. It certainly isn't enough capital to build a self-sustaining business. It doesn't actually build wealth. So isn't a microfinance program offering $10 loans fundamentally useless if it isn't pulling people out of poverty? Why in the world was the demand for a $10 loan so astronomically high?
That is the perfect skeptical question, and it is the exact question that a traditional snapshot-focused economist would ask. If you view poverty purely as a lack of accumulated wealth, a $10 loan makes absolutely no sense. But if you view poverty through the systemic lens of the scarcity trap, it makes perfect sense.
Walk me through the mechanics of that.
Imagine a poor street vendor selling tea. They are operating on razor-thin margins. Suddenly, an unpredictable event occurs. Their child gets violently ill and needs medicine, or the wheel on their tea cart breaks. They have no savings. To survive that day, they're forced to borrow $10 from an informal moneylender, but that moneylender might charge an interest rate of 10% per day.
10% per day. The compounding math on that is completely inescapable.
It is a death spiral. Suddenly, the vendor enters the deepest part of the scarcity tunnel. Every single ounce of their daily labor, every rupee they earn, goes entirely towards servicing the interest on that $10 debt, just to keep the moneylender from resorting to violence. Their entire cognitive capacity is consumed by firefighting. They are trapped.
Okay, I see.
Now, introduce the $10 loan from KGFS, offered at a reasonable, sustainable interest rate.
The vendor takes the KGFS loan to pay off the violent moneylender.
Exactly. You are entirely correct that the KGFS loan does not build wealth. It does not buy a new cart. But what it does is violently shatter the scarcity trap. It stops the immediate hemorrhaging of 10% daily interest. It arrests the crisis.
It buys them out of the tunnel.
It buys the vendor just enough cognitive slack to look beyond surviving the next 24 hours. The trap of poverty begins with tunneling being forced by immediate pressure to make decisions that have catastrophic long-term costs. The $10 loan is a hyper-targeted systemic intervention that attacks the mindset and the structure of scarcity rather than just attempting a macroeconomic transfer of wealth.
It is truly marveling to see how this shift in perspective, this fundamental commitment to mapping out connected structures rather than isolating single events, scales so flawlessly across human experience. We have taken this framework all the way from the abstract Greek philosophy of transcendence into the high-stakes corporate boardrooms of failing tech manufacturers and straight down into the daily, gritty reality of a trash collector in rural India.
Because the underlying physics of human systems are universal. Whether you are managing a global supply chain or your own household budget, structure influences behavior. The slinky bounces because it's a spring. If you want to change the behavior of the system, you cannot just yell at the slinky. You have to find the leverage points in the structure and reshape the metal.
Let's briefly recap the incredible terrain we just covered. We began with Senja's concept of metanoia, the profound shift of mind required to see the whole system, to see how our own actions generate our reality.
We applied that shift to Richard Rumelt's definition of strategic diagnosis, learning that we must rigorously diagnose the underlying, often invisible structures, rather than just endlessly treating the painful symptoms.
We analyzed the tragic, predictable mistake that CEOs make when they get trapped in the snapshot of crisis management, shifting the burden to quick fixes while their organizations succumb to entropy.
We explored the crushing psychology of scarcity, how it forces us into a tunnel, and why preserving slack is the only way to maintain the capacity for innovation.
And finally, we saw how diagnosing the invisible architecture of trust, information costs, and scarcity revolutionized microfinance and altered the logic of extreme poverty.
It is a massive amount of conceptual architecture to process, but it all anchors back to that one central, unyielding realization. Cause and effect are not always close in time and space. We are part of the system we are trying to change.
So as we wrap up, we always like to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something to take away and apply to your own reality right now.
We spent a lot of time discussing the shifting the burden archetype. So I want you to look at your own life, your own team, or your own business and ask yourself a hard question. What action are you taking today? Perhaps a highly celebrated shortcut at work, a quick fix to a recurring argument with your partner, or a symptomatic painkiller applied to a nagging operational bottleneck that might be secretly, quietly structuring the very crisis you will be desperately fighting 5 years from now.
Wow, what quick fix today is quietly building your ultimate crisis for tomorrow. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. You are now armed with the tools to look past the snapshot, to map the patterns, and to unearth the hidden structures governing your world. Next time you feel like you are trapped in a game of whack-a-mole, remember the lesson of the system. You don't need to swing a faster hammer. You need to look under the board.